I'm Lauren Rivers, and welcome to Part 3 of Lauren's Inkwell, Establishing Conflict. When talking about conflict, I prefer to avoid terms like good guy and bad guy because it's an oversimplified way of viewing the concept. When you're young, cartoons tend to present it fairly simply, using colors and shapes to convey which side somebody's on. You'll notice that the good characters usually tend to be in brighter colors and more pleasant locations, whereas the bad guys tend to be the opposite. When you move on to a more advanced level of storytelling, I prefer the terms protagonist and antagonist. Now, the protagonist does not need to be a hero. The protagonist simply means that this is the character you've chosen to follow for the course of your story. The antagonist, by definition, is not necessarily a villain. They are simply somebody whose goals oppose the protagonist's. Now, in your story, your character may be working for a goal with the protagonist working against them, or there can also be stories where they're both attempting to achieve the same goal, but only one of them can successfully achieve it. Conflict is the key to any story. Think of your story as a system always moving towards equilibrium, and conflict is what causes that story to move forward. The story ends when everything has balanced out and things have more or less returned to normal. Scenarios with absolutely no problems are boring and don't tend to provide a whole lot of places for you to go. Conflict is what drives your characters to push themselves beyond their usual boundaries and limitations and advance to new heights that they never would have attempted to achieve if they hadn't been forced to by whatever the events of your story forced them to do. With protagonists, generally, they think of it like everything... How to put this? Protagonists generally tend to do whatever it is that they're doing in their daily lives until something happens. Basically, think of it like a logical interrupt. Whatever your routine is, you're going to keep doing that until you encounter a problem. When you run into an issue, you're going to stop and fix it. You're not going to save the universe if somebody else is around to do it. Conflict has to be personal, essential, and unavoidable. Basically, what that means is that if it's not your universe, you're not necessarily going to care. If you're not necessary to be involved in the story, then why would you try and save the universe? And if you can just sidestep the issue, then there really is no reason for your character to be involved. So it needs to be all three of these things. It needs to be something that requires you specifically, something that is personal to your character, and something that they cannot simply just ignore. With the antagonist, think of it like the equal and opposite reaction to your protagonist. Whatever the protagonist wants is bad for the antagonist's own goals. Now, the antagonist has to be involved in what's going on, or it's like arguing with someone who just doesn't care. If they don't push back, it doesn't work. Basically, you need both sides to be pushing equally in order for there to be a conflict, interestingly enough, to follow for the entire length of the story. So now that we understand the concept of conflict, let's talk about how to create a good one. Remember that the type of story you're working on will affect what sort of conflict you want. Whatever the case, their goals must be opposite. Think of, for example, a love story. One of your characters has an eye on somebody, or they meet somebody during the course of the story. Their antagonist is going to be somebody that is either a romantic rival for the person's affections, or they would benefit from seeing their relationship fail. Whether they ultimately end up together or not is entirely up to you, but there must be a struggle in order for their romance to be believable. In sci-fi, the stakes are a lot higher. The hero has to be forced to intervene and has to have a need to avoid the negative outcome. Simply put, imagine that there's some sort of universe-destroying weapon that's going to take out your home planet. Well, of course, in order to get involved in something like that, you have to have a good reason to be part of the group that's going to save the universe. Since the stakes are so much higher, it's not like you can just sidestep the issue and be like, well, it's not my problem. The hero has to be forced to intervene because, after all, he wants to keep his planet in one piece. And with the stakes being so much higher, there has to be a reason why somebody who might not normally be involved in something like this, why they have to participate. Typically, the conflict will develop from whatever story you happen to be putting together, but the protagonist has to have a good reason to be involved, and it has to have a good reason for why it's them specifically. Now, conflict, of course, doesn't have to be just between the good guys and the bad guys. Conflict among your own cast can add a lot of complexity. You don't want a group that just entirely gets along all the time. Usually, even with people that you're friends with, sometimes you'll get into arguments or fights, and it's not necessarily negative, but it's just kind of like, like when you're discussing a show you like or something, and you start talking about, which character is your favorite, and, you might not necessarily agree with each other, but it kind of adds flavor to your relationship and your discussion, because you're always constantly not butting heads, but you're just kind of having a flavored argument, I guess. I don't know if that's even the right word, but think of it like friends that are having a rivalry between them, these two characters that, they're on the same side, but they're always trying to get one step ahead of the other. That can usually result in some interesting interactions. Or, for example, if you happen to have a love triangle between three of your characters, or as a third alternative, two characters that don't like each other but they're forced to work together. You can have a lot of good material just between the conflict between your various groups. Conflicts exist on many levels, and it doesn't always have to be world-ending consequences. Sometimes it can just be the way that your characters interact with each other that just provides extra material, extra flavor for your story. So now that you understand the basic concept of conflict, it's time to make your characters' lives a lot more interesting. See you in part 4 when we talk about setting. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!